Hi, I'm Geo-Institute Director Brad Keelor. The fact that you're seeing me all by myself at the start of the episode means that it's time again for a special Director's Cut message. And that in turn must mean that we're near a milestone episode and that there's a contest happening. Both of those things are correct. Episode 150 of Director's Cut is coming up at the end of November, and we are thrilled to have geo-legend Ed Idris of UC Davis as our guest. Just as we did for episode 100 with Jim Mitchell, we're running a contest to have the viewers, you, ask Ed a question. It can be anything about his life and career. Submit your questions at the link in the show notes below where you're watching this now, and we'll announce a winner during the 150th episode on November 29th. The winner will receive 1 year of ASCE membership for free, either as a new membership or as a renewal. Good luck, and we're all looking forward to the 150th episode. But first, make sure to enjoy this week's show. Thanks for watching. I am Brad Keelor, he is Rod Salgado. Next up on Director's Cut, find out how and why he became a lawyer. Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Director's Cut. My name is Brad Keelor. I'm the director of the Geo-Institute, and that is why we call this show Director's Cut. Every single week, I sit down with a different GI member who has stories to tell. Some of them are personal, some are professional, all of them are fun. Maybe I should say entertaining because they are also that, but we like to go with fun. If you don't know anything about the Geo-Institute, you should head over to geoinstitute.org after you watch this today, and there you can do a lot of reading. During that reading, you will discover that we are a technical society with about 12,000 members, most of whom are geotechnical engineers and or geologists, and that we are part of the American Society of Civil Engineers. If you like what you see today, and I'm going to guarantee it, you will, you should click like, subscribe, and get notifications, and we will let you know every time we post something to the YouTube channel. With all of that out of the way, I have made a very exciting discovery this morning that we have never had anyone on who is a current Purdue Boilermaker. We are righting that egregious wrong this week, today. Joining us from West Lafayette, Indiana, it is faculty member from Purdue, Rod Salgado. Rod, thank you for doing this.
Thank you for the invite. Very happy to be with you.
And I think, I'm not positive, but I think you might also be the first Brazilian that we've had on the show. So a couple of really exciting firsts today. We will talk about both of those as we get a little deeper into the interview. We have 10 questions the same way that we do every week, and we start with one of the same two that we have in every single interview. Describe your job in 45 seconds.
All right. I think you have probably heard two answers quite often, which is geotechnical engineer and professor. So I'm going to go with professor. So to me, what it means to be a professor is that you're basically seeking to expand your understanding of a subject, which in turn means to really kind of explore cause and effect relationships, maybe be able to model these relationships, which in turn allows you to go ahead and make predictions, calculate things, and so on. So I think that's at the core of anything that we do as professors, which is to really try to develop this deeper understanding of something, and then to share that and help others expand their own understanding of the subject. Typically, this will be students, but also colleagues and other engineers. So I think that's in essence what the job is. So no matter how, what aspect of it you decide to focus on, teaching, research, engagement, it always has to do with that, understanding better and better a particular problem.
I was gonna say, you didn't even say the magic 3 words, but you did there at the end. You went right back to it. But that was a really analytical way to look at it, and I really like that. Um, the last couple of times we've had faculty members on, I've asked them the same follow-up question to this, and I'm gonna keep it going, at least for a few more shows, I think. Did you have a moment in your life where you knew that this was what you were cut out to do, either whether it is research or teach?
I think it was during my PhD work. I had a chance to see in more detail what Jim Mitchell was my advisor, and Mike Yamelkowski, who was also informally, at least, my co-advisor. And I got to see what they did, and research-wise, and in terms of consulting and interaction with students, and their participation in conferences and things like that. And I got hooked. I thought that was an interesting life to lead, and basically that's when I got interested. Really not before I went to get the degree, and not even in the very early stages, but yeah, I guess the interest came during the program.
That's a pretty good tag team of advisors to have, by the way. I feel like if anybody had Jim and Mike, they could pretty much be convinced to do anything, right? So that's why you ended up the way you did, I think. We mentioned at the top that you're from Brazil, and that's why this question found its way in here. And Rod, you're going to give us a total curveball on this one for a response. What's the most ridiculous costume you've ever worn for Halloween or for otherwise?
Yeah, I'll have to disappoint you. To my knowledge, I have never worn a ridiculous costume.
I like the disclaimer there, though. That's excellent.
And I certainly never wore a costume for Halloween. Was not a thing in Brazil. I think there is now some, maybe a little bit more knowledge of it. And Carnival was not big in my home state. I come from Rio Grande do Sul, and you could say it's the kind of the most serious, least laid back state in the country. So I never quite got into it. So sorry, no ridiculous costume to tell you about.
That's okay. Maybe I should have put a question in here about steak. Well, everything on Director's Cut goes back to food, so we might have to do this a little later on in the interview. The third question is always the research question. And we're going to talk a little bit, or you're going to talk a little bit about CPT. It's been a constant throughout your career. Why have you always been a conehead, Rod?
Right. So that was my PhD thesis topic. Jim Mitchell was doing work on CPT. He had worked with the Apollo Moon project on doing CPTs on the moon, and had kind of continued working with it. And then this opportunity came up to work with him and Mike Yamelkowski in Italy, because Mike had a wealth of data from calibration chamber testing there. And I got asked to work on that, and ended up spending a lot of time in Italy. And the work that Mike and his collaborators had done there in terms of CPT testing in the calibration chambers that they had in operation is just fantastic. It was a lot of testing, lots of data. And the bottom line was, what to do with this data, how best to put it to use. So that's kind of what I was asked to go there and think about. And those data were the only information that we had at that time about the relationship between cone resistance and relative density of sand and effective stress state. The tests had samples with all kinds of relative densities and stress states and saturated and dry samples and small and large cones. So it was really, really interesting and useful. And one of the things that came out of primarily those data, but also data from other institutions, Guy Holdsby had a chamber. Jim Mitchell had a chamber back in Berkeley. And one of the things that came out was the clear dependence of cone resistance on lateral effective stress, for example, which was not obvious before then. So what I ended up doing was using cavity expansion analysis to model the data, and very useful relationships came out of that. I continued working on that after my thesis. I did some work with Mark Randolph, with Ross Boulanger on correcting CPT cyclic resistance ratio relationships for lateral effective stress, with Monica Prezi perfecting the relationships that had come out of that work. So it just kind of and it stayed with me. I still work with the CPT. Most recently, I've worked with a student here at Purdue on using the material point method, which is a computational method to simulate cone penetration. So it just kind of stayed with me throughout my career. And it's kind of a fascinating problem because you see every complexity of soil behavior in it. You have all kinds of loading paths, triaxial compression, extension, simple shear. You have large strings and large solid rotations around the cone. You have issues of relative cone to particle size ratios. I mean, there is so much that goes on with that problem, that you can always go back to it to study, for example, a new method of simulation like the material point method. So I hope that was not too long an answer, but it is a really interesting problem.
So I've got a follow-up question and a follow-up comment. We'll go with the question first. In Minneapolis at Geo-Congress a few years ago, we had a CPT versus SPT debate. Do you want to do any trash talking to the SPT community while you've got the floor here?
I think it could never match Paul Main with respect to that task. I think it's pretty obvious that with the CPT you have a quasi-static test that is pretty repeatable, that you can analyze. You can actually go and use the material point method, for example, to actually simulate what happens during cone penetration. While with the SPT, none of that is true. Plus, you have more issues of tool to particle size effects, because you have just kind of a relatively thin wall for your split spoon sampler, that if you start pushing it into larger particles, it introduces difficulties. I mean, there is so much. There is standardization issues despite the name. It's not so well standardized. So, yeah, there is no comparison in terms of quality, but
See,
it still has its place in, here and there, I suppose.
You did a good job. Paul would be proud. I'm sure. I hope he's watching this somewhere. The other thing I wanted to point out, my comment was Ross Boulanger's name comes up more than anybody else on Director's Cut. So we have to do our obligatory shout out to Ross Boulanger there. It seems to happen about every 6 episodes. I don't know why, but it's a tribute to his legend, I guess. One of the things that we talked about before we started the interview was a trip to Brazil I took about 10 years ago for work, and an experience that I had where I went down to breakfast the first morning I was there, and I saw another hotel guest try to speak Spanish to one of the wait staff. And I asked them, does this happen a lot? And they told me that it happens every single day. And I'm always kind of fascinated by this because there are differences between the two languages and they're not exactly interchangeable. How do you quickly explain to people the differences between Portuguese and Spanish?
Right. So um, I think Brazilians would always tend to think that they know more Spanish than they actually do. I studied a little bit of Spanish, so I know a little bit better than average, I guess. But I think there is a lot of similarity between the two languages, particularly with the grammar. There is one verb tense that I can think of that is different. And there are maybe a few more grammatical differences. Otherwise, the grammar is very, very similar. I think the differences come in more in terms of differences between words. Probably there is 70-80% of the words that are pretty common, pretty similar, but then there are some that are different. And in conversations, it will be difficult. It's not necessarily a walk in the park to understand a conversation at a normal pace. So there are definitely differences in that sense. It's not like if you speak one language, you speak the other, but they're very similar. For example, plurals. In both languages, as in English, you add an S at the end to get a plural. If you compare Portuguese or Spanish with Italian, for example, that would be different. In Italian, you change the final vowel, right? So it gets a little more difficult there. So I guess the answer is there is a lot of similarity. It's definitely easy to learn Spanish if you know Portuguese and apply yourself a little bit, but definitely not the same language at all.
I like that. I had somebody say to me once that Portuguese was like if Spanish had stopped evolving in about 1500 and then you threw in a bunch of X's. And I don't think that is exactly correct, but I guess it did come from Galician, right?
Yes. And, there is some scholar who studied languages, Romance languages. And I think what he did was he compared Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, a few other languages, Sardinian, to Latin. And he measured the difference in the languages by the distance from the language to Latin. And Portuguese added, as you indicated, a few other things, some influences from maybe from French or from Gaelic interactions, whatever. So it's more different from Latin than Spanish, which is more different from Latin than Italian is.
Yeah.
So that's kind of an interesting way to think about it. So yes, Portuguese and there is an issue also with pronunciation. For example, even within Portuguese or Spanish, there are differences, right? So if you have Spanish from Spain, it's different from Latin American Spanish. If you speak to a Portuguese person, the vowels will tend to be very different from those that we use in Brazil. They use neutral vowels as in English a lot more than Brazilians. So yeah, so there I go again, with a long answer
That's
about
okay.
languages.
If we ever start a linguistics series within the Geo-Institute, Rod, you're getting a call early on in the series because that was some excellent descriptions there. I really like that. When I learned that you had spent some time in Berkeley, this is the question that I have to ask just about everybody who spent time in Berkeley. Do you have an only in Berkeley story from your time there?
Right. So when I applied to Berkeley, I didn't even know of its history and reputation with respect to movements, social movements that were in the 70s and so on. And when I got there, it seemed pretty regular. I mean, I don't have the same stories as people who attended in the 70s, for example, probably would tell you. One interesting thing that I remember is that the views that we had from the student offices were better than the views that you would get from the professors' offices. So I thought that was kind of unique. I understand it has changed, but that's kind of fun that it was like that at some point.
You too many people probably said that to the wrong people and things got adjusted a little bit. I like that though. So the other question we ask everybody when they come on the show is to think back and to think about how they first got involved in ASCE and then GI.
Right. I think probably the journal was my first stronger connection to ASCE. I don't know if the GI existed at that time. I think it was the geotechnical division or whatever it was called. But I think with the journal, first with submitting papers and then also reviewing papers. I was reviewing papers early on. I think even as a student, I reviewed a couple of papers. And then of course later on I got involved in some committees and attended conferences. But the real connection there, I think, was the journal.
And one of the things I left out from the original 10 questions, and so we have to put it in here, is that last year you were the recipient of the Torrance Award from ASCE, which is effectively like Journal Editor of the Year award, almost like an MVP for all the journal editors within ASCE. You were the first geotech, the first GI member to win this since before GI even existed. What did that mean to you?
I was quite happy, quite pleased with the news. I basically learned from Michelle English from ASCE, but I had a hint that the Technical Publications Committee had been working on a nomination, and it came as a surprise that people were doing this, and I was pleased. It was gratifying that my fellow editors and the people at TPC and colleagues at ASCE thought that I had contributed to the degree that they would consider me for it. So yeah, I was quite happy with it.
Well, we were excited that you won too, and I think everybody was excited to nominate you. And just we have a lot of GI pride within the institute, and so this is something else we can hang up on the wall and let everybody know about. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
I am from Big Ten country myself. I grew up in Michigan, so I'm a little bit partial to the traditions that the Big Ten schools have. SEC, ACC, very nice, but the Big Ten is at the top of the list. And like I said at the beginning, you're the first current Purdue Boilermaker we have had on the show. I had to ask, what Purdue tradition is your favorite and why?
Right. So I guess what I found kind of entertaining funny when I first came here wore the Boilermaker Special, the little train that you can actually ride on campus. And Purdue Pete's appearances on variety of events. But I think the one that I like the most is the presence at the Indy 500. The Purdue marching band is, I think, every year goes there and accompanies whoever sings Back Home Again in Indiana, which I love as a song. And so I think probably that one. And I was very much into car racing when I was younger, and so I kind of connect with that. I try to watch the race. So yeah, I would say that tradition.
So maybe we should twist the knife a little bit here. Do the IU or Notre Dame marching bands go to the Indy 500 to perform, Rod?
I think it's the Purdue band that we see that every year.
Just reporting the facts. Not taking shots at any of our colleagues that might be at either of those other two institutions. My favorite's the Monster drum. I love Monster. I was infatuated with it when I was a little kid, and anybody who has to climb a ladder to play a drum like that, I'm like, that's a winner in my book. That's my personal favorite Purdue one. So the question that we teased at the beginning is that you have a law degree. You are a lawyer. Can you explain why you pursued it, and then maybe talk a little bit about what it was like doing that while you've got your career going on?
Right. Yeah, so I guess I would have to kind of go back to when I was choosing what to do in college, which is early 80s. And Brazil was a closed economy back then, and very traditional. So what somebody kind of in my situation would typically do would be to go to one of the major professions, medicine, law, or engineering. And then, of course, there were some others, but these three were the big ones. And to give you a sense, for example, my girlfriend at the time, her dad was one of the most recognized attorneys in town. She went into law school, right? My friends typically would go into engineering, for example. Their family was primarily engineering, and that was the case with my family. It was basically engineering and some members who had been in the military. So I went with the engineering, but I had seriously considered the other two possibilities. My sister broke tradition, went into medicine. So that's kind of how it worked. So I always kind of followed these professions, just kind of try to understand how they work and so on. And when I came to this country, I got more interested in law because this is one of the common law countries, which is different from what we have in Brazil, for example, which is civil law, which makes the study of law a lot more intellectually interesting because you have all the cases dating back from days before the creation of this country. And I just kind of got increasingly interested in it and how the law kind of stitched this country together. It really was all done through cases, like Supreme Court cases and things like that. And I also saw the usefulness of it. I think we all know that the law is pretty pervasive, it affects everything we do. It basically sets the rules for how relationships operate, duties, rights, and so on. So, the answer is I've been interested in it for quite some time. And then I got into my 50s and I said, it's now or never. And there was a pandemic, which helped a little bit with scheduling and so on. And here I am. It was a lot of work to keep it all going at the same time, but I'm happy that I did it.
So you and Tim Stark are the only GI members I'm aware of. I'm sure there are more, but you guys are the only ones I'm aware of that have done this. If somebody out there was thinking about it and was at a point in their career where it was even a possibility, what would you give them as the top reason to pursue that?
Well, first of all, I think it is extremely interesting. Um, it is interesting and fun because, as I was saying, the common law is basically cases. It's judges dating back from 1162, deciding cases, writing them up, and that stuff getting organized over time. And so you get to learn a lot of stories of they are interesting, odd, scary, entertaining. So it's a really interesting and fun 3 years. And at the end of the day, I think you're prepared to do better in business. You are prepared to do better as an employee, certainly as an engineer, if you want to kind of do both things, or law related to construction, for example, if you want to work with construction law. Because it pops up everywhere: contractual relationships, professional torts, intellectual property, you name it, and if you are doing work in engineering, you run into it. If you have to work with the EPA or some other agency, that's administrative law. So it is very useful, whether you want to, use your engineering degree as starting point and then get into law school, or you want to stay an engineer. I think it's still useful to have it.
That's great. And words to maybe make somebody think a little bit more seriously about pursuing a law degree. I like that. Until last year, you were serving a term as the editor-in-chief of our Journal of Geotechnical and Geoenvironmental Engineering. And we thank you for that. And it's not an easy job. I will put that right out there to begin with. Excuse me. What is your most lasting memory that you'll take from your time as editor-in-chief?
Right. That is a really tough question because I loved every minute of it. So if you could actually remember every minute, I think I would really find every minute memorable. But I think the interaction with my colleagues on the editorial board, particularly the ones in the leadership team, which are the 4 editors working with directly with the chief editor and a few other colleagues over the years. I think that would be it, because I was so impressed with what I've seen, the dedication, the attempt to achieve fairness, the commitment to having fair decisions, which means being fair to authors. It also means keeping the standards of the journal up. It was very impressive and very rewarding to see that. So I guess that would be the main thing. I really enjoyed working with my colleagues, my fellow editors.
I like that a lot. And it's not a thankless job, but it is a little bit. If you're not writing articles yourself and hearing from the editors, it is a little bit of an anonymous job. And so I hope we do a decent job within GI of getting you guys the recognition you deserve, because it's a ton of work, and we really appreciate everything that all the editors do to keep the journals going and to keep them so successful. I think that's incredibly important. We have to get another Brazil question in here. And just in case anybody's planning a trip, thinking about going, hasn't been, maybe doesn't even know a lot about Brazil and needs to, For you, Rod, what's the most amazing spot in Brazil that most people have never heard of or thought about?
Mhm. Well, Brazil is a very amazing country with lots of things that you could visit, that you could do, and places that you could visit. So it's a really hard question from that point of view. I would say that if you are an engineer, if you are a geotechnical engineer, maybe you would like to go to Itaipu Dam and the Iguaçu Falls. It's a great visit. A sightseeing at the falls is really really nice, and the visit to Itaipu is also equally nice. There have been conferences there in the past, so I'm sure some GI members have done that. But that's definitely a visit worth having if you can. But more off the beaten types of things, off the beaten path types of things. Just staying in my home state, I would say the Itaimbezinho Canyon is a fascinating visit, and I went there 6 or 7 years ago, and really there weren't more than 12 people visiting that entire park. So not quite in the tourist list, but really nice, and differently from the Grand Canyon, I think. It's smaller, but it has a lot of vegetation because it's humid climate. And the weather can change really fast. I remember that we were at the end of our trek, and then all of a sudden, 10 or 15 minutes, there was this dense fog that came in. You couldn't see a palm before. I was very happy that we were basically done with it. So you can see that kind of thing happen. It's really fascinating. The other one that I would say that would be more culturally interesting, but still a lot of nature involved, would be the immigration areas in Rio Grande do Sul, the Italian and the German immigration areas. I'll give you an example. There is a small city there called Santa Teresa, which has the only Venetian neo-Gothic tower, a church tower, outside of Italy. So you can run into stuff like that. You can run into a city in which people speak a dialect as it was spoken in Italy 150 years ago. So as I said, lots of things to do and see, but those two would be examples of the kinds of things that you can find.
Oh, that's great. And for people who maybe are not such big geography buffs, look at a map. Brazil is huge. It's ecologically diverse. It's meteorologically diverse. And that's why you could see all kinds of incredible stuff there. You could go to Brazil for years and never even leave the country and not see everything you would want to see, much like the US. We have to have a bonus question, and it's an easy one, I promise, Rod. As people watch this, they're less than a week away from Halloween. Big deal. A lot of candy going to be consumed on that day. What's your favorite candy? Maybe not necessarily Halloween candy. It can be any kind of candy.
Right. Brad, until a couple years ago, I was kind of doing a strict low carb diet. And then my brother-in-law talked me into eating Italian gelato, which he was making. And I got hooked. Now it's Italian gelato far too frequently at home. So I guess that would be my favorite thing.
I mean, I feel like if you're going to have a vice, that's not a bad one to have. I like that a lot. Rod, you made it through all 10 questions. You did a great job. You handled the bonus question. We learned a lot about you. For our viewers, if you liked what you saw, and as I always say, you probably did because you're here at the end, you should click like, subscribe, and get notifications, and we will, of course, let you know every single time we post something to the YouTube channel, which is really frequently. So, Rod, thanks again for doing this.
Thank you, Brad.
I hope it was a good time. And for everybody out there, we will see you in almost a week with our very special Halloween episode of Director's Cut. So be on the lookout for that. And then another regular episode next Wednesday. So have a great week, and we will see everybody soon.